A racist cop smirked as he arrested a black teen, convinced he had just caught another easy target. But when the boy's father, a high-ranking officer, walked in, that smirk disappeared instantly. What happened next didn't just take down one bad cop, it sent shockwaves through the entire system. It was a late afternoon in a quiet, affluent suburb where the streets were lined with towering oak trees and perfectly trimmed lawns. Families enjoyed the soft hum of conversation on their front porches, and the sunlight danced on the windows of stately homes. In this polished, comfortable world, everyone expected nothing out of the ordinary, but sometimes a single moment can shatter even the calmest routine. Officer Brandon Lewis patrolled these streets with the confident swagger of a man who believed he had all the power. Known around town for his harsh demeanor and his habit of targeting black residents, Brandon never missed an opportunity to show off his authority. Today, as he cruised in his patrol car down a wide, quiet street, he spotted a figure that immediately caught his eye. Marcus Johnson, a 16-year-old black teen with eyes that had seen too much for his age, was walking home from school. He wore a faded hoodie and sneakers that had seen better days, nothing out of the ordinary for a young man trying to make his way in a world that often overlooked him. As Marcus rounded a corner near a small park, Officer Lewis pulled his car over abruptly. The sound of screeching tires broke the calm, and the rich neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Stepping out of his cruiser, Brandon's face twisted into a smirk. He strode over to Marcus with an air of superiority, hand slipping into his pocket where his handcuffs rested like a silent promise of punishment. "You there?" he barked, his voice carrying over the quiet street. "Step aside. You're coming with me." Marcus froze for a split second, startled by the sudden confrontation. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked up at the officer, a man whose eyes held no kindness, only disdain. Brandon's words were cold and measured, a rehearsed line that had been used countless times before on people just like Marcus. The officer's tone left no room for negotiation. He was convinced that Marcus was nothing more than an easy target, someone who didn't belong in this well-to-do neighborhood. A small group of onlookers, who had been out walking their dogs or chatting on their porches, paused in confusion. Whispers rippled through the gathered crowd as they watched the scene unfold. Some faces showed shock. Others, a grim satisfaction, as if long-held prejudices were finally being enforced. Marcus's eyes, however, were filled with a mix of fear, hurt, and a burning determination. Despite his trembling hands and the rising panic in his chest, he met Brandon's gaze with a quiet resolve that belied his youth. In that fraught moment, Marcus knew he was being judged not by his character, but by the color of his skin, a truth he had been forced to endure far too often. Officer Lewis, his face hardening with a mix of arrogance and suspicion, roughly cuffed Marcus. "Don't try anything funny," he warned, his voice low and threatening. Every word he spoke dripped with a confidence that came from years of unchecked power, but also from a deep-seated belief in his own superiority. As the officer led Marcus toward the patrol car, the tension in the air grew heavier. The rich neighborhood, usually a place of order and quiet pride, now buzzed with murmurs and uneasy glances. Parents clutched their children a little closer, and passers-by exchanged looks that seemed to say, "This isn't right." Unbeknownst to Brandon, this confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn, a twist that would shake his world and send ripples far beyond the confines of that quiet street. As Marcus was loaded into the back of the car, his eyes never left Brandon's, silently pleading for a chance to be seen as more than the target of prejudice. A few moments later, as Brandon walked back to his cruiser, his confident stride faltered. Somewhere in his peripheral vision, he caught sight of a familiar figure emerging from a parked vehicle down the block. It was a man whose presence immediately commanded attention, a man who could not be ignored. The air seemed to shift, heavy with a mix of foreboding and anticipation, as the stranger's steps grew closer. That figure was Lieutenant Michael Carter, Marcus's father and a high-ranking officer in the very same department. His crisp uniform and calm, measured gait stood in stark contrast to the chaotic scene unfolding. Michael's eyes, steady and piercing, locked onto his son's captor. In that charged moment, the authority that Officer Lewis had relied on began to crumble. The stage was now set for a dramatic collision of power and truth, one that would reveal long-hidden prejudices and alter lives forever. In that first heart-stopping encounter, a single act of injustice had planted the seeds of a reckoning that no one, especially not a racist cop, could have ever anticipated. The air around the patrol car grew thick with disbelief. As Marcus was roughly ushered into the back of the cruiser, every eye in the quiet street seemed to widen in shock. The once confident smirk on Officer Brandon Lewis's face faltered. His stride, once sure and unyielding, slowed as if the very ground beneath him had shifted. Then, from down the block, came the sound of tires on pavement, a low rumble that grew louder by the second. Heads turned as a sleek dark SUV pulled up near the scene. Out stepped Lieutenant Michael Carter, impeccably uniformed and exuding the calm authority of a man who had seen it all. With every step he took, the surrounding onlookers held their breath, sensing that nothing about this day would ever be the same. For Brandon, the sight of Michael was a jarring collision of realities. He had spent years projecting power on these streets, using his badge and handcuffs as symbols of dominance. Now, as Michael's eyes locked onto his own, Brandon's smirk faded completely, replaced by a look of stunned uncertainty. It was as if the air had frozen around him, time itself hesitating at the weight of what was about to unfold. Michael's gaze was steady and unyielding as he strode toward the patrol car. Every step resonated with authority. The crowd, which had grown silent in the wake of Marcus's arrest, now buzzed with hushed murmurs. "Is that his dad?" someone whispered. A few onlookers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and anticipation. For many, this was a moment they had longed for, a reckoning that would expose the hidden cruelty of a system that too often overlooked its own misdeeds. Standing at the scene, Michael's eyes swept over the unfolding chaos. His jaw tightened as he saw Marcus, still trembling inside the car, and then Brandon, whose bravado had melted away under the pressure of his own hypocrisy. In that charged instant, the street seemed to hold its breath. Michael's uniform, shining in the afternoon sun, was more than just fabric and insignia. It was a symbol of justice that Brandon had taken for granted. Now, confronted with a living reminder of what true authority looked like, Brandon's world began to crumble. Michael's voice cut through the tense silence. "Officer Lewis, step aside," he said calmly but firmly. There was no hint of anger, only the steady resolve of a man who knew that respect wasn't something to be demanded by force. The tone was measured, each word deliberate, and it reverberated across the silent crowd. Brandon's eyes darted nervously as he fumbled with the radio, his earlier confidence now replaced by uncertainty. "Sir, I was just doing my duty," he stammered, his voice wavering. But Michael's expression left no room for excuses. He walked over to the cruiser and reached for the door, his presence causing Brandon to step back, as if the very idea of defiance were foreign. The shock in the crowd was palpable. Parents holding their children, elderly residents on their morning walks, even a group of teenagers hanging around on the sidewalk, all watched with a mix of disbelief and anticipation. Social media phones began recording, capturing every moment of this public reckoning. Comments flashed across screens. "That cop just got served," "This is what happens when you abuse power," and "Justice in action." Inside the patrol car, the atmosphere was even more strained. Marcus's eyes, wide with a mix of fear and quiet defiance, met Michael's as the lieutenant gently ordered, "Take him out." It wasn't a command of cruelty. It was a statement that respect and decency had finally come to the fore. The cop's hand, which had earlier clutched his cuffs as if they were armor, now trembled openly, betraying the collapse of his once impenetrable facade. As Michael helped Marcus out of the car, his steady hand on the boy's shoulder, the crowd's murmurs swelled into a chorus of approval and righteous indignation. Even as the situation teetered on the brink of chaos, there was a newfound clarity in the air. Michael's intervention wasn't just about one officer's misconduct. It was a call for accountability that reverberated through every heart present. In that moment, the true cost of unchecked prejudice was laid bare. For Brandon Lewis, the world had shifted irreversibly. His authority, once absolute in his own eyes, now seemed fragile and meaningless under the unwavering gaze of a man who embodied justice. His mind raced as he tried to gather himself, but the damage was done. Michael's calm yet commanding presence had forced him to confront a reality he had long denied. The consequences of his actions were coming for him, and no amount of bluster could hide from that truth. The ripple effect spread quickly. Neighbors who had previously turned a blind eye now exchanged looks of approval, and a few whispered, "Finally, someone stands up to him." The atmosphere, heavy with a mix of tension and hope, set the stage for what would become a turning point, not just for one officer, but for an entire community that was beginning to demand real change. In the tense silence that followed Michael's firm command, the atmosphere around the patrol car became charged with an unmistakable mix of dread and anticipation. Officer Brandon Lewis, still reeling from the shock of seeing Lieutenant Carter, who was not only a respected figure in the department but also Marcus's father, now found himself face to face with a truth he could no longer ignore. His earlier smirk had vanished, replaced by a haunted look in his eyes that spoke of deep regret and a dawning fear of the consequences. Michael stepped closer, his uniform crisp and his expression unyielding, a stark contrast to Brandon's faltering resolve. "Officer Lewis," Michael said in a calm but icy tone, "you have no right to treat any person like they're less than you, especially not a kid who's just trying to get home." His words, steady and deliberate, cut through the heavy air. Around them, a few bystanders dared to meet Michael's gaze. Their faces were a mixture of relief and righteous indignation. Brandon's mind raced, memories of past encounters swirling through his thoughts. Years of unchecked arrogance, dismissive sneers, and demeaning orders that had once filled him with pride now coalesced into a single, crushing moment of accountability. His hand, which had so confidently gripped the handcuffs seconds before, now trembled as he struggled to form a coherent reply. I was just doing my duty," he mumbled, voice cracking under the weight of his own hypocrisy. Michael's eyes flashed with quiet fury as he replied, "Your duty is to protect and serve, not to bully and intimidate. If you had any shred of decency, you'd have let Marcus go without causing a scene." The words hung in the air, each syllable heavy with the promise of consequences that Brandon had never imagined. Inside the cruiser, Marcus sat quietly, his eyes still wide with a mix of fear and a resolute calm. He watched the confrontation unfold, his heart pounding with the hope that perhaps this was the moment when things might finally change. The crowd on the street, now gathered in an increasingly tight circle, whispered among themselves. "That cop's finally being held accountable," someone said, and the murmurs grew into a chorus of voices echoing the sentiment of long overdue justice. Meanwhile, Michael turned his attention to Brandon, his voice softening just a fraction as he added, "This isn't just about you, Officer Lewis. It's about restoring trust in our community, and it starts with each one of us taking responsibility for our actions." Brandon's eyes darted around, desperate for a way to cling to his former authority, but he found none. In that moment, his carefully constructed facade of power lay in tatters, and he was left with nothing but the raw, painful truth of his own mistakes. The ripple of the confrontation spread quickly. Neighbors who had been watching from a distance now leaned in, some recording the moment on their phones, others exchanging looks of approval and relief. For a brief instant, the rich, well-ordered world of the neighborhood was disrupted by a shockwave of accountability. Social media buzzed with live updates and whispered hashtags, "Cop Reckoning" and "Justice at Last," emerging almost instantly. Inside the police department, the impact was immediate. Several officers who had overheard the incident exchanged uneasy glances, silently acknowledging that something needed to change. Michael's intervention wasn't just a personal rebuke. It was a public declaration that authority must come with respect. The seeds of internal reform had been planted in that charged moment. As the confrontation wound down, Brandon's shoulders slumped, and he sank onto a nearby step, the enormity of his failure sinking in. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, and for the first time, he saw the stark truth in the eyes of those who had once admired him. The echo of Michael's words lingered in his ears like a verdict he couldn't escape. In that singular, emotionally charged moment on that quiet street, a clear line had been drawn. It was a line between arrogance and accountability, between the old ways of unchecked power and a future where respect was earned through humility and genuine service. And as the sirens in the distance began to wail, signaling that higher authorities were now aware of the incident, the transformation that had been long overdue was finally taking shape. In the hours following the confrontation, the quiet street that once echoed with confident steps now buzzed with a tense energy. The image of Lieutenant Michael Carter, his uniform immaculate and his gaze unyielding as he confronted Officer Brandon Lewis, had ignited a spark of change that could not be ignored. By late afternoon, word of the incident had spread like wildfire, not just among the residents of the upscale neighborhood, but throughout the entire city. Inside the police department, the atmosphere was heavy with whispered conversations and anxious glances. In a cramped briefing room, several officers gathered, their faces etched with uncertainty as the news of Brandon's public humiliation and the appearance of Michael's badge circulated on every news channel and social media feed. The department's leadership was forced to confront a truth that had long been swept under the rug. Unchecked power fueled by racism was tearing the institution apart. At a hastily called meeting, Captain Reynolds, a veteran with a weary but determined look, addressed his team in a low, measured tone. What happened yesterday isn't just an isolated incident. It's a wake-up call for all of us. We cannot allow personal prejudices to dictate how we serve our community. His words, spoken with a weight of experience and sorrow, resonated in the silent room. Some officers nodded in reluctant agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably, knowing that their own actions might soon be under scrutiny. Meanwhile, the community outside was coming together in unexpected ways. Local residents who had witnessed the unfolding drama on the street began organizing impromptu gatherings on front lawns and in community centers. They shared stories of similar abuses, of times when they or their loved ones had been humiliated by officers who assumed superiority without question. A middle-aged woman tearfully recounted how she'd once been treated as though she were invisible simply because of the color of her skin. Another man, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hope, declared that change had to come, no matter the cost. On social media, hashtags like #BadgeOfShame and #JusticeForMarcus trended for hours. Videos of Michael Carter's calm yet resolute intervention, juxtaposed with Brandon Lewis's faltering confidence, fueled a public outcry that demanded accountability. Comments flooded in from across the nation, people from all walks of life expressing their support for the young teen and condemning the systemic abuse of power. Back at the scene, as dusk settled and streetlights flickered on, Brandon Lewis sat alone on the curb outside the now empty patrol car. His face, once so sure and commanding, was now a canvas of regret and humiliation. The gravity of the moment weighed on him as memories of his past actions, those unthinking, cruel moments, came rushing back. In the solitude of the night, every whispered insult, every demeaning act, replayed like a relentless echo of his own making. He knew that tonight, as he faced the cold judgment of his peers and the community, his life would never be the same. Across town, Michael Carter returned to his car, his eyes still fixed on the spot where the confrontation had taken place. He felt a bittersweet mix of pride and sorrow. His intervention had been necessary, a stand for justice that he had hoped would reverberate through the ranks, but it had also exposed deep fissures in the system he had sworn to uphold. Michael's mind churned with thoughts of accountability, of how many lives had been altered by the callous actions of officers like Brandon, and of what must be done to rebuild a trust long eroded by prejudice. In the days that followed, the ripple effect of that fateful moment grew into a full-blown reckoning. A thorough investigation was launched into Officer Lewis's conduct, and disciplinary actions were swiftly enacted. Rumors of internal reforms began to circulate among the ranks. Some junior officers, emboldened by the public exposure of their superiors' misdeeds, began speaking up about the need for better training on implicit bias and the importance of treating every individual with dignity. Their voices, once stifled by a culture of silence, were now joined by a growing chorus demanding a change, a transformation that would begin with accountability at every level. At a community town hall meeting a week later, residents from all over the city gathered to voice their support for meaningful reform. The meeting, held in a modest auditorium with worn wooden seats and a simple stage, became a forum for raw, honest conversation. Elderly neighbors, young parents, and even local business owners stood side by side, united by a common desire for justice. They spoke of hope, of the need to change a system where authority was too often abused, and of the power that lay in collective action. The mood was electric, a blend of anger, resolve, and cautious optimism, as one voice after another shared their personal stories and demanded that no one be above accountability. In that moment, the once silent call for change transformed into a powerful movement. The painful events of that day had not only exposed the ugly reality of systemic racism, but had also sparked a new era of transparency and reform. For Officer Brandon Lewis, the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with consequences. For the community, it was the first true step toward healing, a promise that justice, however delayed, would finally prevail. As night fell over the city, the shimmering lights of the rich neighborhood and the quiet determination of its residents stood as a testament to the fact that true power is not measured by force, but by the courage to change. And in that charged atmosphere, every whisper and every tear carried the message that accountability begins with the willingness to confront even our darkest truths. In the quiet hours of the morning after the tumultuous events, the city awoke to a renewed sense of purpose. The echoes of that fateful day still lingered in every corner, from the hushed murmurs in the neighborhood to the determined faces at community meetings. The dramatic confrontation between Officer Brandon Lewis and Lieutenant Michael Carter had set in motion a chain reaction that could not be ignored. At the police department, a formal review had been initiated. Brandon Lewis, now isolated and shamed, faced not only internal disciplinary measures, but also a stark realization of the consequences of his actions. In a dimly lit briefing room, new protocols were discussed with somber faces and a quiet determination to prevent such abuse from ever happening again. Junior officers, emboldened by the public reckoning, stepped forward to share their own stories of witnessing injustice. Stories that had long been stifled by a culture of silence. Slowly, a movement for change was taking shape within the department, fueled by the courage of those who dared to demand accountability. Across the city, the community rallied in ways that had once seemed impossible. In a modest town hall, residents, from longtime neighbors to young families, gathered to share their experiences and dreams for a better future. The air was filled with a mix of sorrow for past wounds and a resolute hope for healing. One elderly man, his voice trembling yet resolute, declared, "We can no longer stand by and let hate rule our streets. Today we take a stand for every person who has been pushed aside." His words, simple and heartfelt, resonated with everyone present, turning whispered grievances into a unified call for justice. At a public memorial held in a local park, a vibrant mural was unveiled. The artwork depicted a young black boy, whose unwavering courage had sparked the change, standing beside a humbled cop whose defiance had crumbled under the weight of accountability. The mural, awash in colors of resilience and hope, became a living symbol of the transformation that was underway. Families, students, and community leaders gathered around it, each person silently promising to never let injustice go unchallenged. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Michael Carter, whose steady intervention had marked the turning point of the day, addressed the city at a press conference. His voice was calm yet impassioned as he said, "We must learn from our mistakes. True authority is not about force or fear. It is about respect, empathy, and the courage to change. Today is a new beginning for our community and for our police force. We owe it to every citizen to rebuild trust and honor the dignity of all." His words, broadcast live and shared widely on social media, ignited a spark that reached far beyond the precinct. For Rick Carter, the father whose secret past had been exposed and whose life had been irrevocably altered by his son Malik's courageous outcry, the path to redemption was uncertain and fraught with pain. Alone in his study, surrounded by relics of a life built on privilege, he stared at the faded family photos and the long-forgotten journal where his unspoken cruelties were recorded. A single tear slid down his cheek as he whispered, I must change not just for me, but for those I have hurt. His voice, soft and broken, carried the weight of a man coming to terms with the irreversible cost of his prejudice. Though the journey ahead promised no immediate absolution, it was the first honest step toward a future where truth could heal old wounds. In that final cinematic moment, as the sun climbed over the horizon, the city bathed in a gentle golden light. The screen slowly faded to black with one simple, powerful message. Redemption begins when we have the courage to face our past and the determination to build a better tomorrow. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that challenge injustice and inspire change. Join the conversation and help spread the message that every act of accountability can reshape our world.